Hey Fred, good morning. Live, breathe, believe. How you doing?
Good morning, Anil. Doing good. And you?
Hey, I'm doing well, thanks. I'm doing well. Um, it's been a interesting week so far. I'm actually quite excited about this topic today. I feel like it's something that is in the air, and I figure we can dive into it ourselves. And that's around failure. And my thought of the day is failure is rewarding. And as potentially controversial and as crazy as that can sound, I really do believe that. Hey, man, let me just pass it to you. What are your initial thoughts on failure can be or is rewarding?
Well, first, when you suggested the topic of failure, a few things came into my mind. One is the fear of failure, one is like actual failure, big and small. And I think that plays into um, I think their failure can be rewarding. And then the third part is perceived failure and failure as a kind of life story. And there I think it's not rewarding. So those are kind of the three angles that came to my mind when you mentioned this topic.
No, I'm with you. Let's start with the latter. What about failure do you think cannot be rewarding?
Um, it's the part where someone tells themselves a story about being a failure, about their life being a failure, about perceived failure in a very broad sense. It's one of these stories that don't serve the individual. And when you start poking at it, it turns out not to be as true as they thought. One of the somewhat arbitrary narratives, but not totally arbitrary in the sense that it has this classic negative bias of, choosing to shine the light on those particular moments when we didn't live up to our ideals or when we didn't achieve what we or someone else had expected. And I do think that is sometimes arbitrary or sometimes even, constructed very negatively. And that does not set us up. That is not rewarding in the moment. And that doesn't set us up for future success or happiness.
So three words that I caught on to there: story, negative, and moment. And I think that's what I find is quite interesting. It's like if I pay you $100, just as a reward for doing great work, you're gonna think that perceived value in the moment. You're like, wow, I've got $100. A week or two could go by and go, wait, just $100? That's it? I mean, I'm
Mm.
pretty sure I should have deserved $500 or $1,000. So you can have a positive sensation in that moment and a positive narrative, and then later have a negative response to it or sentiment to it. I feel that failure can be rewarding because in the moment it's got that negative, and what we're going to discuss that a bit more.
Hmm.
But I feel like if you really give that thought or reflection a week or two later, you might actually find, hang on a second, that actually was incredibly valuable and rewarding, in hindsight. And so I find it interesting how it's all about that narrative we tell ourselves in the moment versus after the fact.
Absolutely. When something happens at work, or, for entrepreneurs, you certainly have this roller coaster of perceived success and failure along this route. And it can feel a certain way in the moment. And then you learn something from it. And it reminds me of this story of, that who knows what's good or bad. Things happen, and then it seems bad, and then we reinterpret it. Something else happened, it seems superficially good, and then something bad comes out of that. And I think that's the roller coaster that we're on, that we can get off, or that we can just judge a little bit more realistically. That um, what were our expectations realistic? Are we setting good goals for ourselves? It brings me to this idea of, shooting for the moon and hitting the treetops or something like that, which, sometimes that's right. Sometimes it might be better to set realistic goals and achieving them because it gives me a certain momentum. So, yeah, I mean, I agree. It's this idea of, like, to me, it feels like a bit of a roller coaster. that we can get off and look at and reinterpret what was really up, what was really down, what did I learn, what am I going to do next time.
No, I love that. I think the goals versus expectations been involved in certain conversations in the last couple of weeks at work. And yesterday I had a conversation, a catch up with two very close friends that I work with that I really regard them and their thoughts quite highly.
Mm.
And we kind of said, were we really set up for success? And did we really go into this with? And we started evaluating because we felt like we'd failed. We didn't feel like we had succeeded.
Mm.
And it was kind of like, well, were our goals and our expectations from the start set up for success? And when you start to evaluate, again, going back to my example of $100, if your expectation was a reward, then and you got a reward, happy days. If your expectation was I want to be rewarded and I'm hoping that it's like a 5-figure sum, suddenly you're letting yourself down, or you feel let down because that perception has clearly not materialized in what you would have hoped or what you would have expected.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's a really interesting point. So there are a couple of things that come together for me there. One is this idea of, as I mentioned before, shooting for the moon and hitting the treetops, which some people seem to like.
Mhm.
Um, but then you bring up this point of like, were we set up for success? And you might, in a post mortem, say like, well, did we have the resources needed to reach our goals? And it becomes that's when the shooting for the moon thing seems a little bit delusional, because you probably weren't resourced to reach the moon, so it wasn't a realistic goal.
Yeah.
So how are you going to learn next time in terms of what resources you need to reach a certain goal, and then to have a realistic plan to resource it properly, to allocate enough time to reach that goal, and then to reach it? That's much more replicable than, you know, resourcing something to reach the treetops, hoping to reach the moon, going somewhere in the middle, creating a story about how that was really a success in the end. I think it can be harder to learn from that. And learning from failure, I guess that comes back to the point of one of the things that makes it rewarding.
One of my favorite expressions is figurative and literal, right? And so, not to take your figurative statement of shoot for the stars and end up in the treetops literally, but yeah, you're right. If you need rocket fuel, if you need a ship that can go into space, if you need the right materials, right clothing, the right experience, expertise, all that, and you don't have it, all you have is, let's say, I don't know, a booster or a
Yeah, yeah, piece
helicopter
of
or
rope. Yeah.
a rope. Like you are only resourcing yourself to get there, and maybe you're feeling failure because you just set those expectations incorrectly. So in
Mm.
fact, the fact that you reach the treetops is higher than where you were before.
Mm-hmm.
So you're on the right track. You're on the right trajectory. You're just the distance you can cover to get there is not realistic.
Absolutely.
Um, and I think it's interesting that we berate ourselves, we bring ourselves down back to the ground and think, man, shit, I didn't really achieve what I wanted, and I'm a failure. And then probably a week or two later, you're like, well, hang on a second, did I have all those things to get to the stars? No. So
Yes.
okay, now I need to start over.
Exactly. And specifically from, let's say, the marketing field, ideally, I think marketing campaigns work better if you have a specific goal, right?
Mhm.
So it might be like to change the minds, or to get a very specific target audience to try a product, or it might be to raise awareness more generally. And those are different goals and will require different campaigns. And then, of course, if you have a campaign and you don't have clear goals, afterwards you can always find a metric that makes you look good, right? And
Mhm.
you get to sometimes paint the bullseye on afterwards and say, ta-da, we did it. We reached this kind of social media goals or whatever. But if you're being honest with yourself, I think most people would agree that setting a specific goal for a campaign is a better way to do it, and then being honest about whether you reach that goal or not is going to set you up better for future success, rather than having too many goals, vague goals, running some kind of random campaign, and then painting the bullseye around the arrow afterwards, in terms of saying, well, what seems to work all right, let's claim that that's what we're shooting for.
I take a few things from that, and I really appreciate that. One is, um, having worked with folks in marketing brand, I think sometimes they almost feel like, well, no, it's the intangible. It's like you said, it's changing minds. How do you measure changing minds? Is it, as you see now on Instagram, is it the number of likes, number of views, number of follows? Is it, can you quantify it? Well, we have a target for 1,000. Well, why not 2,000? Well, 1,000 we feel is more realistic. Okay, cool. It's almost like making sure you have something that's relevant and measuring that attempt, that approach.
Mm.
I think the
Yeah,
second
yeah,
thing is the goals have to be clear. If they're vague, they're intangible again, great. But if they're vague, you're not really able to measure yourself accurately, or let's say as objectively as you can. And I think the third thing is just being honest, and we go back to that narrative. If you have a narrative that's just, fueling evidence where it's just not there,
hmm
you're not going to be honest, and
mm.
you're gonna be biased, and you're
Yep.
suddenly gonna think, was this a failure? No. Well, yeah. And you're not going to be real with yourself. And I don't think until you're real with yourself and what you've done, you're not able to really objectively say achieved, not achieved, lesson learned, great,
Absolutely.
let's do this differently, or with more gusto or clarity the next time.
Yeah. I think related to that, a couple of stories I heard recently are around um, this, failure has become quite popular and
Mhm.
something positive. And you get to learn from failure or failing fast and things like this. And it could become an excuse not to plan. So this is the point that came up in a couple of conversations that I had, that if failure is seen as something too positive, then you just say, well, we're going to learn from it, and we're going to fail fast, and we're going to repeat, and so on. And it was used as an excuse to circumvent a discussion about, again, probably coming back to this point about planning and resourcing and setting goals, which I think is much preferable.
Mhm.
And then, of course, if you do fail, you want to learn as much as possible from it, but you don't want it to become an excuse
Mhm.
not to make the best attempt or not to set the clearest, most appropriate goal.
Let's make this personal, because
Hmm
I think that failure, just on the back of what you said, because I think when we talk about companies, I think failing fast and what you just mentioned, I think some companies have the ability to fail fast and move on and continue, and some campaigns do. Let's talk about people, because I think one thing that bugs the crap out of me is when you sit down at your year end or mid-year or quarterly review, it's what have you achieved? It's what have you done? What was your silver bullet that you're famous for? And I kind of, I never get asked, okay, what was your biggest failure? And what did you learn from it? You get that in an interview. So if you're sitting down
hmm
in an interview and they're like, they really want to, like, what are your weaknesses, areas of development, your biggest failures, your biggest ups, like
Yep.
what, and you're like, but when you're sitting in a moment where you're trying to evaluate your performance, it's all about, well, what have you done that's positive?
Yeah.
What do you why is it you think that, let's say, people like a manager and an employee, they don't want to talk about failure and almost give it that reflection and treat it as positively as a success?
Right, right. As you say that, it makes me think that, now we have some very positive memes around failure. But I
Yeah.
think broadly we're coming from a culture where failure is very much stigmatized.
Hmm.
And of course, failure is not rewarded. And, most of the time it probably shouldn't be, but it is part of the process. Um, so it does seem like talking about failure in the context of quarterly or annual review would be counterproductive and would not be a natural part of a discussion about why someone should be given more responsibility or paid more or get their bonus or whatever it might be. I do know one Swedish media company, they probably don't do this anymore, but they used to have a conference, and people would be chosen to bring a failure, something they screwed up during that year.
Okay.
And I believe an award would be given, but also a fine. So you had to be very careful
Okay.
to like calibrate the level of screw up. And,
That's
I think it can
a
be an
reward. That's
interesting
a
part of a
penalty, man.
culture. Yeah. So you can, as part of a conference or a larger gathering, if you're, if that's part of the company culture, air some things, destigmatize certain things by consciously bringing them out into the open. So, taking these things together, it seems like we have a complicated relationship with failure, like where our culture is coming from. We often talk about, you know, Silicon Valley culture accepting and even celebrating failure. I think there's some truth to that. Like it might be more stigmatized in certain other parts of the world. Um, but then maybe we've swung too far in terms of a little bit glibly ac- celebrating, accepting, or even fetishizing failure as something much more valuable than it is. For example, I think Peter Thiel also has this expression that you don't learn as much from failure as you might think because your failure is overdetermined. So you tell one story of how you failed, and it gives you the idea that if you'd fixed that problem, you would have succeeded. But it's not true. You
Mm,
would have failed for any of other four reasons that are now not part of your narrative. So learning from failure is perhaps also overrated in some contexts.
no, that's true. It, it's I think it comes back to balance, right? I think what we do is on the spectrum of celebrate failure versus success. Success is like massive. It's like, someone whoever wins a Super Bowl this Sunday is
Mm,
going to be like there's a parade and there's a ring, an invitation to the White House, and whoever loses and fails, like they pretty much just okay, better luck next season.
yeah.
And I think it's just a matter of finding a healthier balance. You're right. Like it may not be, you know, um, penalizing folks with a fine for their biggest failure, but I think I love the idea you said of destigmatizing failure, and I think maybe that's where I think where I really wanted to go
Yeah.
deeper with you on, because we love to share best practice of success, and I think only recently we started sharing best practice of failure, and not dwelling on it per se, not overanalyzing it and getting stuck in it and paralyzed,
Mm-hmm.
but finding a way of, okay, what did you learn from that failure of yourself? Like, what did you learn about you? And so I guess let's go deeper into, again, the person. How do you as a coach help your clients destigmatize their sentiments, their feelings when they have failed and they come to you and they go, I've failed. What do you How do you typically approach it with them?
Mm-hmm. Um, well, I'd say it hasn't come up recently, so I'll kind of make something up or just think about it a bit on the fly. And I probably comes down to just maybe before that, the structure that evolved from me as we're talking about this. It's like to follow a timeline
Mhm.
where we say, failure has to be in relation to an expectation. So, do we believe in setting goals and planning and so on? Yes, I think we do. And then there is the project or an outcome or a match itself. And then we judge that as a success or a failure. And
Mhm.
maybe that judgment is sometimes too hard or absolute. But we do have some kind of a judgment afterwards. And I do think it's very useful to review, to learn as much as possible, both from successes and failures. And there, the point about what expectations are you measuring against? What do you think was going to happen? Were you set up for success, as you're saying? And what can we learn from the elements that were successful and the elements that failed? And how should we move on to set goals and to achieve our goals into the future? And as time goes by, there should be some alignment between how we achieve our goals in individual projects and how we feel about the whole thing, right? So
Mhm.
if you have a company and over a couple of years is making a loss, you should not be claiming that all your initiatives are successful, because that's just very odd. That becomes delusional.
Bullshit, for honest
Yeah,
ourselves.
yeah.
I mean,
Similarly, if someone has some moderate professional success, a reasonably good life, um, doing things that they believe are the right moves, and then they might still feel like a failure, and no one else sees them that way. Then there is the sense over time that the perception is just wrong. There's this perception of failure that evolves over time that probably comes from that stigma. that's not helpful, not useful. It's not part of a review. It's not part of getting better. Just a general feeling. So those, I think, that kind of timeline brings in the different components of what we perceive as failure, how we deal with it, and how we tell a story that may or may not include failure, over a longer period of time.
Fred, on that. Oh, go ahead, mate.
Yeah, so I think in terms of those were kind of the background thoughts, and so I would like to put it in that light with someone who is, dealing with failure. If they just had something big that they perceived as failure, what's the silver lining? What can you do from it? Telling a story of, if you want to take risks, if you want to make big bets, sometimes these things will go against you. To learn as much from it as you can, and to move on.
So I want to go into this just a bit further. So again, I love how you're just keeping it super simple. It's failure versus expectation. So like, what was your expectation, and based on that, how have you failed? where I do where I do feel people where I feel recently people go wrong, I am included in that, is something doesn't go the way you want it to, so you feel anxious, you feel stressed, you suddenly get into a bit of a spin. I happened
Yeah,
to me last night, even
right.
with my sisters, my girlfriend. I was just like, I just felt flat, and I just felt like, oh, I've just not achieved today, or I've not achieved in the last week or two or three, like what I really wanted to, and I don't feel I've succeeded. And you know, my sister didn't comment. She said, "Okay, feel as you feel."
Mm-hmm.
Okay, cool. Um, she was very kind, very gentle in that sense. And then I spoke to my girlfriend afterwards, and she was just like, just reflect on what you have done, and just set yourself one expectation a day, one thing that you want to achieve a day, and
Mm-hmm.
just take it day by day. And I think what was really cool about that was it was taking the anxiousness and the stress kind of away, but not forcing it away, but just kind of, okay, relax, breathe, set one thing that you want to achieve. So it's expectations
Right.
are reasonable,
Yeah, yeah.
and then just learn from that, like, okay, and just take it step by step, day by day. And I find that I'm someone who I do set massive expectations for myself. Like if you saw my to-do list per day,
Mm-hmm.
thankfully it's come down to 3 things a day that I want to achieve. Now it's down to one.
Mm-hmm.
It's come down from like a laundry list of 20
Yeah.
things of shit, for example. But now that I've got just that focus, it just reminds me it's much easier for me to, as you said, how do I correct it? How do I
Mm.
correct how I'm dealing with that failure, that sense of failure? And I just love also how you said silver lining, because it's something that I think 2020, I always go like, there are gray clouds, there's silver linings. So massive cloud, find those silver linings. Fred, how have you had to deal with failure on your side where you weren't able to learn from it? You almost struggled with it. You're almost kind of like resisting to learn from it.
I think so. Uh, so I think you highlighted something very interesting, which is about the expectations part and how it makes us feel.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's definitely something, if we have certain expectations, we have a goal that we want to reach, and some kind of deadline is drawing near, a feeling of like, if I don't put the work in, I will fail. I think that's pretty useful, right? If it makes you do the work,
Mm-hmm.
because in the end it's going to connect to, like, I set a big goal for myself. At one point I got worried that if I didn't do the work, I wasn't going to reach my goal, and that was probably a realistic prediction for the future.
Mm-hmm.
And then you work harder and you do what was required and you reach the goal. But then of course that can go too far as well.
Mm-hmm.
If a
Yeah.
goal is very achievable and you've done what you can, and then it's time to drop it, right?
Yep.
But to have an honest assessment as you go of, like, no, studying for an exam is that kind of experience where, like, how much work is enough, right? and you study a few more hours or something like that. And some people are super ambitious, but also worried, and they study a lot and then they still talk about all their worries and so on. And, maybe some people, I hesitate to say don't worry enough, but, don't see this connection clearly enough between the work that goes in, what you can actually do about it, and the goals that you want to achieve. So I think there is a balance there to put the work in, to be realistic about what's going to be required, to remember the goals that were set, and not to renegotiate them with late in the evening or something like that. To be reminded of what the goal was and what work was going to be required to get there. But then when you've done that, to stop worrying, or to say, yeah, that was it. I'm happy with that effort that I put in, because there are also other considerations in life. Apart from this goal, we also have our health, we also have relationships. And, I'm putting this in a kind of specific context, but let's say in the context of a professional goal,
Mhm.
there are also other considerations, and we don't want to get out of balance for too long. In my case, certainly, I think growing up, I was probably not very good at sticking with goals. My priorities seemed to change a lot. I was easily distracted by new shiny objects. I like starting projects. And that was one of the reasons why I didn't achieve certain goals. And it took me a long time to be honest about that. Um, there's also something that happened in terms of certain goals that I reached and certain goals that I didn't reach, that I was certainly not honest about how I had caused those outcomes.
Mhm.
Sometimes we are lucky to get a win despite a horrendous process, or not putting enough work in. And I think that can work both ways with failure as well. And it's difficult. I found it difficult to be honest with myself in my assessment, and really, take full responsibility, not to blame other people, not to blame circumstances, but to really focus honestly on what I did and what I could have done better to get the outcome that I really wanted. Because there's something there as well about like sour grapes, saying like after you don't get it, that you didn't really want it. So there's something there about realism and honesty, and sticking with the process of honest planning and honest review.
There was some amazing sound bites that came out of that. So I just want to like go through a couple of them with you. So one, I love the idea of the if I then I will, right? And it's almost sometimes people see that conditional thinking as negative. Like that's almost like, but if it's realistic, if it's super clear, if I do this work, if I eat this sandwich, then I will be full. It's realistic.
Mm,
Uh, if I eat this single cashew, then I will be full. Okay, maybe not realistic. And it's not harmful. It's not a
mm,
harmful condition.
mm,
I think that those conditional ideas do need to be realistic, and they need to be kind and compassionate. I don't feel they should be unreasonable.
yeah.
Right? The
Mm,
second point you raised in terms of putting the work in, the connection of work to goals. I think sometimes we forget that. And maybe we're a bit critical of ourselves. Like, okay, did you put in the work? Well, yeah, I worked 80 hours last week and I still didn't get there. Yeah, but first off, did you need 80 hours? And did you work smart or did you work hard? Like, which brings it to the third piece, which is maybe your priorities shifted. Maybe what you were trying to achieve or what you were focusing on shifted. And that happens. I think we need to allow ourselves to acknowledge that our priorities will shift day to day,
for sure.
especially if you're a parent right now who's homeschooling and working and trying to stay healthy and looking after your partner and you're trying to look
Mm,
after your business. There's so many priorities that are going to shuffle not only within the week, within a day, but within the hour. And I love how you said at the end there's, so what could I have done better, but doing that in a compassionate way, because otherwise you're going to end up paralyzing yourself rather
yeah,
than
yeah.
really setting yourself free.
Right. Yeah, it makes me think of a couple of things. Um, with the priorities shifting, I
Mhm.
think it's fine for priorities to shift if they shift consciously, but they should not be shifted by a wandering mind.
Mm,
uh, and be allowed to shift in a way where the stated priorities are just an excuse to do, whatever we feel like in that moment.
yeah.
So the two things where I that I work on and where I check, my kind of daily motivation and goal achievement is with exercise and meditation. And I notice I used to set higher goals for myself in terms of exercise. Like,
Hmm.
oh, I'm going to set aside an hour to exercise. And then after half an hour, I'd be like, yeah, that was pretty good. And I'm tired and I have this thing with my knee. And, so I'd quit. Uh, and now it's become very important for me. Similarly, if I go out for a run, I do not get to change my mind about how long the run is going to be unless, I'm so injured that I literally cannot move, because I know it will have ups and downs. I
Yeah.
know, especially in the beginning, will be hard. So whether I commit to a 5 or a 10K run, I will make sure to do it. And if I say, I would rather say that I'm going to exercise for 45 minutes than an hour and just check the time and make sure I do it. Because I know the way I work is that, after 20 minutes, it'll feel tough and I'll start negotiating with myself to say, well, you know what? I exercised yesterday as well. And, I've done a pretty good job and it's raining. And, that whole conversation with myself, it's something that I don't want to have. And it becomes even clearer when I practice meditation, because it's the same. If I say, and I usually just do it for 10 minutes because I think that's reasonable and it's something that I can do, rather than saying, like, all right, today I'm going to shoot for an hour. And then the thoughts come up like, well, I usually only do 10. So I know it has a benefit. And, it starts an internal dialogue that I just want to not have. So I come back to the goal I set and say, nope, was it 10 minutes? All right, then 10 minutes is fine.
I love
And
that.
I'm happy. And I tick the box and I've achieved my goal. And then I can reassess it for the next day or the coming week to say, okay, now I'm really going to commit. I'm going to set a different intention to do something more and then to do that.
See, you brought in intention, which I think again is powerful. But we're going to come back to that though in a second, because
Mm-hmm.
I think going back to when you say priority shift, one thing I do, I jot mine down. I have to like have them
Mm-hmm.
down. And if I realize I've got more than a certain number of priorities, I'm like, suddenly it's ironic how priorities is a word. It should be priority, not priorities. Because at the end of the day,
It's
like,
true.
you know what I mean? It's a
Good
weird
point.
whirl that
Yeah,
we throw on that, but jot them down and then be conscious of them so they don't shift, as you said, minute to minute, unless it's absolutely almost not the
of
same. Like
course. Yeah, yeah.
I love your example on exercise and running. And and even we had the conversation about meditation. I told you I want to meditate for at least 30 minutes a day. And you're like, hey man, what's the loss if you do it for 10 minutes versus the gain? I was like, actually, I gain by doing 10 minutes, I lose by doing zero, trying to shoot for 30. And you're like, well, then just do 10. And I was like, that's so true. And now there are days where I miss it. And then there are days where I do it for 30. And there are days I do it for 10. And it's like, but you're right. It's being very clear. My goal for today is I just want to meditate. I work out and I have a coach who gives me a training plan every week. And I took an easier ride indoors on Saturday, and I chose not to run on Sunday. Instead, I did my run program on Sunday on Monday. And I got a comment from him yesterday saying, hey, you should have gone longer on the bike on Saturday if you were going to take Sunday off and not do that. And I was like, hang on, man. In the moment on Saturday, I treated that ride for what I felt on Saturday. Sunday, in the moment, my body was like, it maybe blue skies outside. I'm not ready to run today. Take today off. And so I ended up doing that program on Monday morning because I was like, look, I know what I want and what I feel. Just getting out there and doing
Mm.
it was already a check mark and I felt good. So I think sometimes you even have to like, if there, we didn't talk about this when it comes to failure. Again, earlier we did. Now, those external voices, you have to know what your goals are and set your own intentions and not let those external voices steer you to doubt, steer you to go, oh man, yeah, I didn't do that. Man,
Mm.
I should have gone for that. I should have. No, no, no. What did you want to do in that moment? And what was your intention?
Mm-hmm.
That's more important than,
Yeah, yeah.
with the noise around you.
Exactly. I think it also brings me back to this point that the people are different,
Yeah.
in terms of what their natural style is. And I can imagine, so for me, it's about setting the goal and sticking to it. That's very important, because I'm quite good at feeling how I feel, and checking in with how my body is doing. And if I'm not feeling well, I take it easy, or something like that. And I know that there are some people who are very motivated to reach all their goals. And then there is, for example, with sports, the risk of getting injured, right? When is the right time to say no? Like, I should not stick with this plan. My knee is not going to hold up. I
Mhm.
need to reassess it. That's also a point of balance, or self-preservation, where I think we want to strike that balance, and we want to go against our type.
I agree, but it also goes back to the resources, right? That we're applying the right
Hmm.
resources to it. If your leg isn't well, take the aspirin, give it rest, give it ice, do things that, if you're not giving yourself the resources, you're going to trip and fall. You're going to fail. It's only going to get worse. So
Right. Yeah.
failure, you hit rock bottom here. Actually, you could actually go further and further down if you're not learning and resourcing yourself up to again move forward
Mm.
and go higher.
Yeah.
Um, so Fred, I mean, just kind of thinking about this, I think what we've kind of nailed on the head is the perception of failure, and maybe I love to say that we're trying to destigmatize how failure can be rewarding if your intentions, your goals, your expectations are clear, honest, and that you're putting the work in and you're resourcing yourself in the right way. But it always comes back to, what narrative are you telling yourself and what are you learning from it? So if you're feeding yourself bullshit and that narrative is absolutely like, you know, you are going to feel like crap. You are going to feel like you failed, and it's going to have a negative reaction or impact on you. But if you actually find the right way to learn, and you really do set realistic expectations, I think you can fail, like you said, learn, and then move on. Like, you don't have to dwell on it. You don't have to really
Yeah.
give it any more time and attention than it deserves.
Hmm. Absolutely.
Cool, man. The last thought I have is also, I just feel like when it comes to doing the work and giving it the attempts, if you don't attempt it, obviously you're not going to know if you win or lost, if you failed or succeeded. So I think until you get out and do that run, until you shoot for that star, until you um, go out and just do what it is you feel like you need to do,
Mm.
attempt it. I think that, in my opinion, is already a success. And then it's just a matter of, how many attempts to get to where you want to go. And it could take a number, it could take none, but you got to give it a go.
I think that's a great way of framing it. I think that's absolutely right.
Cool, man. Well, Fred, as always, a pleasure. Look forward to our next chat. And until then, hey, everyone, big hugs, heaps of love. This is Anil and Fred. Live, breathe, believe. Take
Thank you.
care. Thanks, Fred.